The fog rolled in thick over the civilian shooting range just outside Bar Harbor, Maine that morning, cold, still, and quiet. Frank Sullivan, a retired submariner turned range safety officer, sipped from his thermos and watched the shooters arrive through the glass of his booth. Most were regulars, hunters zeroing their scopes before deer season, hobbyists with shiny, over-modified rifles, and the occasional off-duty deputy. But that morning something was different. She walked in alone, mid-30s maybe, wearing faded jeans, a plain gray jacket zipped to the collar, and a red Sox cap pulled low over her eyes. She carried a long, nondescript case and moved with the kind of quiet confidence that made Frank take notice. Not cocky, not trying to prove anything, just intentional. She didn't ask questions, didn't nod at anyone, just walked to the farthest lane, lane 9, and began to unpack. Frank leaned forward, no range bag, no spotting scope, no hearing protection on her ears, just plugs. Her rifle wasn't standard issue either. It was custom-built bolt-action, matte black, no visible markings. She assembled it fast, far too fast, and with hands that had clearly done it thousands of times. And then she began to shoot. The first target, 100 yards. Dead centered. 300. Still center. Fifth, nearly 1,000 yards. Still center. Frank blinked. He'd worked with SEALs, Delta boys, recon Marines. What she was doing shouldn't have been possible without a high-end ballistic computer, or at least some kind of wind meter. But she never checked a thing, just scanned the field, adjusted slightly, and squeezed the trigger. "Hey, Frank?" One of the regulars stepped into the booth, uneasily. "That gal down at lane 9, she didn't check in. No badge, no permit, and I swear she's hitting steel at distances I can't even see with my scope." Frank nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, "I see it." By the time the local police showed up, 2 young officers with hands too close to their holsters, she had fired over 50 rounds. Every single one had found its mark. "Mom," the senior officer began, "we're going to need to see some ID and a permit for that rifle." She turned slowly, hands visible. "Calm. I don't have those with me," she said. Her voice was low level. "No license. No ID," the officer repeated. "No, sir. They checked her belongings. No wallet. No phone. Just a metal key card with no markings and a small, weathered notebook filled with what looked like GPS coordinates. "You're going to need to come with us, ma'am." She didn't argue. Didn't ask why. Just stood up and let them cuff her. But Frank noticed something else as she was led away. Her eyes, they never stopped moving, scanning the tree line, watching reflections in the windows, tracking exits, sightlines, wind. She wasn't nervous. She was calculating. Back at the small sheriff's office in Hancock County, she said nothing. Fingerprinted, photographed, still no ID. They ran her prints, nothing. State and local systems came up empty. The sheriff, a good man named Harold Daniels, muttered under his breath, "What the hell kind of ghost are we holding here?" Detective Jake Mallory took over the questioning. He was a veteran officer known for cracking even the toughest cases. He tried kindness, pressure, even hinted at federal terrorism charges. But she sat there stone still, eyes clear and calm. The only time she spoke was when a young deputy brought her a cup of water. As she took it, her sleeve slipped up just a bit, revealing a faint scar on the inside of her wrist, a half-inch slash with clean, sharp edges. Jake had seen it before. Special training, he said later to the sheriff. Rope burns. Probably fast rope descents from a helicopter. But still, no answers. By dusk, she was in an orange jumpsuit, silent as ever. She sat in her holding cell like she was simply waiting for something. Or someone. And that someone arrived the next morning. The courthouse in town was packed. Reporters, locals, a few men in dark suits who never gave names. She was brought in cuffed, flanked by 2 deputies. Her attorney, a frazzled public defender, stood helpless beside her, whispering furiously, getting nothing in return. Then the doors swung open. Rear of the room, heavy boots, and silence. A U.S. Navy Admiral, full-dress uniform, ribbons glinting under the courtroom lights, walked straight down the center aisle. 2 officers followed him. No one spoke. Several veterans in the gallery stood, instinctively at attention. The Admiral handed the judge a sealed envelope. She read it. Stopped. Read it again. Her expression shifted, annoyance to surprise to something like reverence. She banged the gavel. All charges dismissed. This case is classified by the Department of Defense. Court is adjourned. The gallery erupted in gasps. A bailiff removed the woman's cuffs. She stood, shoulders squared. "Sir," she said softly to the Admiral. "Apologies for the inconvenience." The Admiral's reply silenced the entire room. "On the contrary, Commander Barrett, the Navy owes you an apology." Frank watched the news later that night. They never named her. But he knew who she was now, Commander Evelyn Barrett, and she hadn't come to practice shooting. She'd come to stay sharp, just in case. The patrol car pulled up quietly just past the parking lot of the range. Two deputies stepped out, their boots crunching the gravel. They didn't come in hot, no sirens, no hands drawn, but Frank Sullivan could read the tension in their posture. One of them, Deputy Travis Kemp, looked barely out of his academy days. The other, Sergeant Bill Harper, a local lafer with 20 years on the force, wore a face like stone. Lane 9 was still active. The woman had returned to prone position, adjusting her grip, preparing to fire again. Harper raised a hand, signaling for her attention. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "we're going to need to see some identification and a permit for that weapon." She stood up slowly, unhurried, as if she'd been expecting this moment for hours. Her hands moved where they could see. No sudden movements, no challenge, no fear. Just calm. "I don't have either," she said evenly. Kemp blinked. "You don't have any ID?" "No, sir." Harper frowned. "Do you have anything on you? A phone, wallet, anything we can use to confirm who you are?" Wordlessly, she unzipped her jacket and handed over 2 items. A key card with no writing, no photo. Just a black magnetic strip and a small leather-bound notebook filled with what appeared to be coordinates, handwritten in tiny, neat script. Harper flipped through the notebook. "What are these?" "Locations," she replied. He waited, but she didn't elaborate. Kemp's hand twitched toward his belt, unsure. "Mom, without ID or a weapons permit, we're going to need to bring you in for questioning." "Understood," she said quietly. "You're not going to resist?" "No, sir." They cuffed her. Not once did she flinch. Frank, still watching from the booth, felt something shift deep in his gut. He'd seen hundreds of people get arrested, some angry, some scared, some trying to talk their way out of it. But this was different. She didn't look surprised. She looked like she was following a plan. The cruiser ride was short. The Hancock County Sheriff's Department wasn't built for big operations. 3 cells, 1 detective, 1 sleepy dispatcher, and a coffee machine that hadn't worked since Veterans Day. They booked her in without incident. Fingerprints were taken, silent. Mugshots, silent. Even when the deputy tried to get a name, a birth date, anything at all, she offered nothing. "You understand refusing to identify yourself is a crime, right?" Deputy Kemp asked, more nervous now than before. She nodded once but said nothing. Detective Jake Mallory came down from his office around noon. He'd spent 2 decades dealing with smugglers, poachers, even a few foreign operatives drifting through the coastal waters. He figured this was just another drifter, maybe a wanted militia type who thought shooting long range made her dangerous. He started soft. "You hungry? We've got fresh coffee." "Name's Jake." She said nothing. He tried pressure next. "You're looking at federal charges, no ID. Suspicious materials. Possession of an unregistered weapon. We found coordinates in that notebook. That raises a lot of red flags." She remained still, hands in her lap, eyes alert, breathing steady. He leaned in. "You think staying quiet protects you? It won't. Homeland Security will be here by tomorrow. They won't play nice." Still nothing. "Who are you?" he finally asked, voice low. She looked up at him, calm, focused, and said nothing. Hours passed. Mallory ran her prints through every database he could access, state, federal, Interpol. Nothing. No matches. No record of arrest, no known alias, no concealed carry permit. She might as well not exist. A rookie deputy, sent to bring her lunch, returned wide-eyed. "Sir, I noticed something." "What's that?" When she reached for the cup, her sleeve moved up. "I saw a scar. Right here." He pointed to the underside of his wrist. It wasn't random. Looked like it came from rope burns. Like fast rope, helicopter training. Mallory narrowed his eyes. "That wasn't the kind of scar you got from falling off a bike." He returned to the holding cell. "Climbed a few mountains, have you?" She looked up. Her voice, for the first time in hours, was audible. "Rock climbing accident," she said. He almost laughed. Sure it was. By the time the public defender arrived late that afternoon, the woman had become something of a myth around the station. Half the staff thought she was ex-CIA. The other half thought she was a terrorist sleeper cell. Nobody could agree. Nobody had answers. And she wasn't offering any. Her attorney, James Weller, a man with too many cases and not enough patience, slid into the interview room already frustrated. "You're making this hard," he said after a few minutes. "You want out of this? You need to talk. Homeland's involved now. FBI might be. They're calling this a threat case." She said nothing. "You were carrying an unregistered sniper platform and a notebook full of location data. No license, no name. They're building a terrorism profile. Still nothing. Do you want to go to court in shackles, or do you want to walk out of here free?" No reaction. Weller groaned and tossed the file on the table. "Fine. Have it your way." That night, Mallory watched her through the observation window. No pacing, no restlessness. Just stillness, like a soldier on watch. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't fear. She just waited. And that unnerved him more than anything else. She didn't act like a criminal. She acted like someone who'd trained her whole life for moments exactly like this. Detective Jake Mallory had dealt with his fair share of liars, talkers, and bluffers. But this woman wasn't any of them. Since stepping foot into the holding cell of the Hancock County Sheriff's Office, she hadn't said more than a few words, and none of them told him what he needed to know. She sat quietly, back straight, hands folded, as if time didn't apply to her. No restlessness, no questions, just observation, and that was what made Jake nervous. Most suspects, innocent or guilty, asked questions. "Why am I here? What's going on? Can I make a call?" But this woman, she studied her environment like it was part of a mission. Not curiosity, not boredom, calculation. The holding cell was no more than 8 by 10 feet. Gray concrete walls, a steel bed frame bolted to the floor, a single observation window above the door. But she'd cataloged every inch of it within the first few minutes. Jake knew because he was watching her through the hallway camera feed. Every movement subtle, precise. When guards rotated past her door, her eyes followed without being obvious. When the deputy dropped off food and water, she noted which pocket he reached into for keys. And when the janitor walked by humming, she clocked the rhythm of the door code he tapped in just a few cells down. This wasn't a woman afraid of her situation. She was logging it. Meanwhile, the fingerprint results were still blank. Jake had run her prints through the main state database. Then the FBI. Nothing. The Homeland Security system, delayed due to a system outage, was flagged for escalation, but no timeline had been given. As far as every agency was concerned, she didn't exist. Jake sat at his desk, flipping through the notebook they'd pulled from her rifle case again. Dozens of GPS coordinates. Some were in state, deep woods, old trails, former military facilities. Others were across the country. One listed only a series of numbers with a note beside it, sunrise only, low wind. "What the hell is this?" he muttered. Across the room, Deputy Kemp returned with an update. "Sir, we checked the keycard, no company logos, no name. RFID chip embedded inside, same type the Navy uses. Also that scar. I showed it to my cousin. He served with the 160th. He said it's textbook for fast, rope insertion burns." Jake exhaled sharply. "Which tells me she's had special training, but somehow doesn't exist in any records." Kemp nodded. "Exactly." Later that night, after most of the station had cleared out, Jake walked back to her cell. The corridor was quiet. Just the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional creak of the old HVAC system. He stopped outside the reinforced glass. She looked up, met his eyes. He stared back. "Mind if I ask something?" he said. She gave the faintest shrug. "Why stay quiet? I'm not accusing you of anything yet. Not officially. You could just say you're a contractor. Show me one piece of ID, and this whole mess starts to unravel." No reply. He tried again. "You know what everyone here's thinking, don't you?" Her gaze didn't waver. "That you're a spy, or maybe a foreign agent. Maybe you're not even American." Still, she said nothing. He glanced at the notebook in his hand, then tapped the edge of it against the bars. "These coordinates, are any of them targets?" Her voice broke the silence for only the second time since she'd arrived. Their memories. Jake tilted his head. What kind of memories? But she had already turned away, back to sitting on the edge of the bench, hands folded, eyes now fixed on the opposite wall. He left without another word. An hour later, Deputy Harper tapped on Jake's shoulder. "You're not going to believe this," Harper muttered. "I just got off the phone with the Regional Homeland Office. They ran a secondary trace on the keycard. Couldn't get anything, except this weird redirect protocol." Jake looked up. "They traced it back to a server that doesn't exist anymore. You know what it was tagged with." "What?" "CBGRCV Black Label System, dismantled in 2012, Jake frowned. "Wait, I remember that name. Wasn't that part of the Naval Counter-Infiltration Initiative during the Gulf Resurgence?" "Yeah, and you're not supposed to remember it." Jake stood up slowly. "This woman isn't just trained," he said. "She's been buried. Intentionally." By midnight, the woman had taken her second sip of water all day. Again, her sleeve shifted just enough for the camera to catch the faint scar. Not accidental. Not faint. Trained eyes would know exactly what it meant. And Jake Mallory's were trained enough. He returned to the camera feed, this time rewinding footage from earlier that day. Her pacing was limited, but exact. 3 steps from wall to bench, each turn precise. She never wasted movement, never slouched, never blinked more than necessary. It wasn't detachment, it was control. She had been trained not to flinch, not to panic, and, most importantly, not to break routine. And that's when he realized something she wasn't hiding because she was guilty. She was staying silent because she'd been taught that silence keeps people alive. By 6 a.m., the system had finally updated. Jake's desk phone rang. "Sheriff's Department." "Mallory, Detective Mallory, this is Special Agent Craig from Homeland. You have someone in custody we're taking immediate interest in. We're sending a detail for transfer. No questions, no jurisdiction arguments." "Wait, hold on," Jake replied, heart starting to race. "Can you at least tell me her name?" A pause. "Her name is classified," the agent said. "But the Admiral is en route." Jake blinked. "Admiral. You'll understand soon. Just make sure she's at the courthouse on time this morning. And do not, under any circumstances, try to question her again." At 7:15 a.m., the woman was escorted into the holding van, still silent, still watching, and still ahead of everyone in the room. Jake stood at the curb and watched the van disappear down the foggy morning road, a strange feeling tightening in his chest. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. But he was certain of one thing now: they hadn't arrested a criminal. They detained someone built to disappear. The morning mist still clung to the windows of the Coastal Harbor Courthouse when Deputy Harper unlocked the rear door of the transport van. Commander Evelyn Barrett, though no one yet knew that name, stepped out without resistance, her posture calm and upright despite the chains around her wrists and ankles. She wore the orange jumpsuit like it was just another uniform. Detective Jake Mallory stood nearby, arms crossed, watching her carefully. He still didn't know what to believe, but one thing was clear: this woman wasn't afraid. The courtroom was unusually crowded for a Wednesday. Word had spread that something strange was going on. An unknown woman arrested at the range, no name, no ID, and now multiple federal agencies requesting access to her. Reporters from Bangor and even Boston had shown up. What was supposed to be a routine arraignment had somehow turned into the most closely watched court proceeding the small town had seen in decades. Inside, Judge Caroline Winslow sat at the elevated bench, skimming the morning docket with clear irritation. She had served on the bench for over 20 years, long enough to know when something didn't smell right, and everything about this case reeked of red tape and withheld information. At the defendant's table, the woman sat quietly next to her public defender, James Weller, who looked like he hadn't slept. His client hadn't told him anything, not her name, not her background, not even why she was carrying an unregistered sniper rifle and a notebook full of coordinates. He had nothing to work with. "Your Honor," Weller began, standing with wary hesitation, "I respectfully request a continuance. My client has been uncooperative, and I've not had adequate time to prepare her defense." Before Judge Winslow could respond, A man in a gray suit rose from the second row. Your Honor, Agent Robert Langley, Homeland Security. We are formally requesting immediate federal custody of the defendant, as her case involves potential threats to national security. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Another man stood from the opposite side of the gallery. He wore a dark navy suit and carried a leather briefcase marked with the seal of the FBI. Your Honor, Special Agent Michael Greer, FBI. We also have an active interest in this individual. We believe her to be connected to an ongoing federal investigation. Judge Winslow's brow furrowed. She banged her gavel once firmly. Gentlemen, this is still a state courtroom. We will proceed with the arraignment and then address jurisdictional disputes. Until I say otherwise, she remains under my authority. A clerk stepped forward and began reading the formal charges. Possession of an unregistered firearm, failure to identify to law enforcement, suspicion of engagement in activities related to national security threats. The courtroom was tense. Even the air seemed to still. Then it happened. The double doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open, and in walked a U.S. Navy Admiral. Full dress uniform, medals shining, presence unmistakable. He walked slowly and deliberately down the center aisle, flanked by two officers in similar attire. The room fell silent. People who hadn't stood for a flag in years now rose to their feet without even realizing they had done so. Veterans straightened their backs. Reporters stopped writing. Even Judge Winslow, a former military lawyer herself, instinctively adjusted her posture. The Admiral did not speak. He didn't introduce himself. He simply approached the bailiff, handed him a sealed envelope, and stepped back. The bailiff brought it to Judge Winslow. She broke the seal. And read. The courtroom waited. For a full minute, the only sound was the faint ticking of the clock above the judge's bench. Her face shifted slowly as she read. Confusion turned to understanding, then to something else. Respect. Maybe even awe. She looked up, her voice steady but different now. Quieter. Heavier. In light of the enclosed documentation from the United States Department of Defense, all charges against the defendant are hereby dismissed, effective immediately. This matter is now classified as a national security issue. She struck the gavel once more. Court is adjourned. Chaos erupted. Voices rising, reporters scrambling for statements, even the federal agents frozen in place. But not the Admiral. He walked calmly to the defense table, nodded to the bailiff, and gestured toward the woman. The cuffs came off. The woman stood, and for the first time she spoke clearly. Sir, I apologize for the inconvenience. The Admiral returned the salute with words that silenced even the most frantic observers. On the contrary, Commander Barrett, the Navy apologizes to you. At that word, Commander, everything shifted. The bailiffs snapped to attention. The courtroom stilled once more. No longer a mystery, no longer a suspect. She was one of them. But not just one of them. She was someone above them. The Admiral nodded toward the door, and she followed. As she passed Detective Mallory, he caught a glimpse of something he hadn't seen before. Not the rigid self-control of someone hiding, but the quiet command of someone who no longer needed to. She met his eyes, and he finally understood her silence hadn't been fear. It had been duty. Outside the courthouse, under the morning sun, the Admiral opened the door to a black government SUV. Barrett turned back for one last look at the town that had tried to process her as a criminal. No bitterness in her face, no smugness. Only peace. Then she got in and disappeared. Not into the shadows, but into the kind of light most people never get to see. The bailiff hadn't even finished unlocking the final restraint when the weight of the word Commander settled over the courtroom like a tidal wave. Commander Barrett. For a moment, it didn't register. Then, as if on cue, every military veteran in the room, retired Navy, old Marines, a couple of National Guard men in their Sunday best, rose to attention. Slowly, deliberately, some with stiff knees and bad hips, others with tears forming in their eyes. Not one of them had to be told the judge stood too. Not out of protocol, but out of something deeper. Respect, reverence, recognition. The woman who had sat in silence for nearly 48 hours, who had been shackled, booked, and nearly labeled a threat to national security, now stood upright, hands free. Her posture shifting from quiet observance to something unmistakable military command. It was in the way her shoulders squared, the way her chin lifted, the way her presence filled the room, not with noise, but with certainty. The Admiral stepped closer, still calm, still measured, and spoke not just to her, but to the courtroom as a whole. "Commander Evelyn Barrett," he said clearly, "has served for 12 consecutive years in special operations, including numerous deployments under classified assignments with naval special warfare. Her identity, rank, and service record are protected under federal confidentiality statutes due to the nature of her missions." He paused, scanning the room. No one interrupted. Not the reporters. Not the agents from Homeland or the FBI. Even Judge Winslow remained silent, her hands now clasped on the bench in front of her. The Admiral's voice softened. "We didn't come here to protect her. She never asked for that. We came here to acknowledge that we failed her by asking her to carry a burden in silence, and then letting that silence be mistaken for guilt." Then he turned to Barrett. "Commander, the Navy owes you an apology." And just like that, Evelyn Barrett, call sign never spoken, mission logs forever redacted, became someone. No longer Jane Doe. No longer suspect. But Commander. Detective Jake Mallory stood near the back of the courtroom, watching it unfold with the same sense of awe that filled every other square foot of the building. It wasn't just the revelation that hit him. It was the sudden clarity. Every unanswered question now made sense. Her silence, her calm, her impossibly perfect shot placements at the range, the scars, the way she moved, as if trained not only to fight but to disappear. He realized he hadn't arrested a threat. He'd arrested someone who had spent her life defending against them. And yet, not once had she raised her voice or used her authority to escape. Because real authority doesn't demand attention. It commands it quietly, from those who know how to look. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed. Reporters shouted. Federal agents made phone calls they weren't authorized to explain. But Commander Barrett said nothing. Her silence wasn't mysterious anymore. It was deliberate. The Admiral opened the door to the black SUV, but before Barrett stepped in, a familiar voice called out, "Commander." It was Mallory. She turned. "I owe you an apology," he said, stepping forward, hands unclenched. "We were just trying to follow protocol, but I should have seen it sooner." Her reply was immediate, warm, but still strong. "No apology needed, Detective. You did your job, and you did it well." He blinked. "You knew I was watching you in the holding cell, didn't you?" She smiled faintly. "I knew someone was. I was hoping it was someone who would pay attention." Back inside the SUV, the Admiral handed her a manila envelope. "Your equipment has been returned," he said. "The firearm, the notes, and your credentials have been reinstated on the secure server. You're fully operational again." Barrett opened the folder. Her eyes scanned the contents. Mission orders. A familiar operation name printed in bold Silean Harbar. She nodded once. "Understood." The Admiral turned serious. "You sure you're ready?" She looked out toward the harbor. A Navy vessel sat anchored beyond the fog, only the faintest silhouette visible to civilian eyes. "Some of us never stop being ready," she said. And she meant it. That night, back at the range where it all began, Frank Sullivan locked up late. He moved with the same quiet efficiency he always had, but something was different. He paused at lane 9, where the woman with no name had made impossible shots with impossible calm. The lane was empty now. But the memory of that day stayed sharp in his mind. As he turned to head inside, he heard the soft hum of a vehicle pulling in. The headlights shut off. A door opened. "Evening, Frank." He recognized the voice instantly. "Back so soon?" he asked. Commander Barrett stepped out of the SUV, dressed in civilian clothes again, but this time with nothing to hide. No slouched posture, no baseball cap, just a woman who knew exactly who she was. "I came for my gear," she said. "And to say thank you." Frank nodded. "You know, most folks would have tried to explain their way out. You just waited?" "That's what training teaches you," she replied. "Sometimes silence is the only cover that works." He unlocked the office and handed her a case. "It's all there. I kept it in the safe." She took it gently. "I appreciate your discretion. You could have stepped in before they cuffed me." "Wouldn't have mattered," Frank said. "And besides, I figured you had a bigger story to tell. Just needed the right people to listen." She looked at him a long moment. You ever think of coming back into the fold? I did my time. Now I keep the lights on and the lanes clean." She smiled. "That matters more than you know." As she drove away, Frank stood in the fading light, one hand raised in a quiet salute. Not for the uniform, not even for the rank, but for the kind of courage that never asks to be seen and never needs to be. The courthouse had emptied by noon. What remained was silence, the kind that lingers after something extraordinary happens, when people know they've witnessed a moment history won't record, but will never forget. Commander Evelyn Barrett sat quietly in the back seat of the unmarked Navy SUV as it wound its way along the rugged coastline. The Admiral sat beside her, papers resting on his lap, though neither had spoken since leaving the courthouse. At last, he broke the silence. "You handled it well?" She didn't look at him, just kept her eyes on the horizon. "It wasn't over yet." He nodded slowly. "No, but it is now." She turned to him. "Is it?" 10 months earlier, she had been dropped into a world no one outside the intelligence community even acknowledged existed. Her assignment was known only to a few senior officers and marked under a code name etched in silence: Operation Silent Harbor. At its core, it was a counter-terrorism operation, but not the kind people saw in movies. There were no raids, no flashy takedowns, just long days, longer nights, and layers of civilian identity so carefully constructed that even Barrett herself sometimes forgot what name she was supposed to respond to. The threat? A multi-pronged plan to paralyze the eastern seaboard by simultaneously attacking 3 major shipping ports: Boston, Norfolk, and Charleston. The damage wouldn't just be physical, it would be economic, strategic, and psychological. If it succeeded, the ripple effect would cripple naval logistics and civilian infrastructure for months. But the conspirators didn't know they had a ghost in their midst. Barrett had spent nearly a year embedded along the coast, posing as a drifter, a dock worker, a surveyor, even at one point, as a visiting geologist for a shoreline research project. Her job wasn't to stop the attacks directly, but to identify the network who was funding, who was planning, and who could trigger the chain reaction. The problem? When you go that deep, coming back out is complicated. She maintained her cover with precision. No contact with command, no digital footprint. Every move logged in her own shorthand, every critical detail stored in her notebook. The same one that now sat safely in the Admiral's briefcase. But 2 weeks before the final phase of the operation, a variable changed. One of the suspects, an ex-military contractor, had taken notice of her. He didn't say much, but Barrett could tell he was watching. Patterns broke. People stopped talking when she entered a room. The trap was closing faster than she'd planned. And so, she did the only thing she could. She disappeared from the mission field and resurfaced where no one would expect a civilian shooting range in Maine. There, she waited. Not for rescue, for containment. She knew she couldn't make contact without risking exposure. Knew that any direct extraction would alert the people she'd been tracking. So she let herself be arrested. Let herself be processed like a stranger. Let herself be booked, photographed, locked in a holding cell. She let the system do what it was trained to do, because she trusted that someone up the chain would notice. And they did. Back in the vehicle, the Admiral handed her a file. "This came in while you were in custody. One of the targets, we've confirmed his role in coordinating the port logistics. He moved 3 days ago, Baltimore. They think he's trying to find a backdoor route through that old rail tunnel near the harbor." Barrett scanned the photos, then the satellite images. "He's accelerating. They know they've been compromised." "Yes," the Admiral said, "but not by who? You gave us what we needed without giving yourself away." That was the point. She leaned back. The tension she had held for nearly a year, the stillness, the silence, the posture of someone who could never drop her guard, finally began to ease. "So what now?" she asked. "Now," the Admiral said. "We finish it. You rest. The rest of us act." Barrett turned to the window again. "You sure they won't come looking for me? They don't know your name. They never did. Only your shadow." 2 days later, a coordinated sweep along the eastern seaboard resulted in 15 arrests. 2 were U.S. citizens with ties to international arms traffickers. 3 were foreign operatives embedded in maritime shipping companies. The rest were local contacts with just enough training to be dangerous. None of them ever mentioned the woman at the dockyards, or the quiet hiker near the harbor, or the geologist who disappeared without a trace. Silent Harbor was declared a classified success, but only a handful of people knew why. Weeks passed. Barrett didn't return to any base. No ceremony, no interviews. Instead, she was given a temporary apartment in Virginia Beach under an alias and a private debriefing schedule that spanned 3 weeks. During that time, she declined leave, declined reassignment, and, most notably, declined to speak about her detention. Not once did she criticize local law enforcement. Detective Mallory followed procedure. She told the Admiral, exactly as I needed him to. At the end of her final debriefing, she stood, gave a crisp salute, and made a single request. If possible, sir, I'd like to return to the range in Maine. Not to shoot, just to sit. The Admiral raised an eyebrow. To remember. Barrett nodded. No, sir, she said softly. To forget. 3 months passed. Detective Jake Mallory returned to his routines in Coastal Harbor, Maine, paperwork, petty thefts, the occasional disturbance at the local bar. Life resumed its old rhythm, but he wasn't the same. Not after her. He still thought about that courtroom. The way she stood, not like someone found innocent, but like someone who had never needed a trial to begin with. The way the Admiral had spoken her name, Commander Evelyn Barrett, as if it belonged to a legend whispered between walls. He hadn't seen her since. He hadn't expected to. It was late on a Thursday when the phone rang. Detective Mallory, he answered, sifting through a file on his desk. Detective, this is Admiral Nathaniel Wallace. We met briefly during the Barrett arraignment. Jake immediately straightened. Yes, sir. I'm calling on behalf of Commander Barrett, the Admiral said. She's receiving a commendation tomorrow. It's a private ceremony. No press, no photographers. But she asked that you be invited. Jake hesitated. I'm honored, sir. But I don't understand. I arrested her. She remembers, Wallace replied. She remembers that you followed the book when others might not have. The next morning, Jake passed through 3 security checkpoints on his way into Naval Station Norfolk. The guards were polite, but thorough. His name had been added to the clearance list at 0600 sharp. Inside, the ceremony was already beginning. The room was small, no more than 50 people, many in civilian clothes but with unmistakable military bearing. Some had the eyes of combat veterans. Others moved with the deliberate economy of intelligence officers. There were no medals, no pomp. Just silence, respect, and duty. At the front stood Admiral Wallace. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, we are here to recognize Commander Evelyn Barrett for extraordinary service during Operation Silent Harbor. Jake sat in the back row, unsure whether he belonged there, until he saw her. Commander Barrett stepped forward in full dress uniform. It was the first time he'd seen her in anything but handcuffs or a jumpsuit. The transformation was startling. Ribbons across her chest, her nameplate, the seal trident glinting on her left breast. And yet, she still carried herself with the same calm, quiet strength he remembered. Admiral Wallace continued. For 11 months, Commander Barrett operated deep undercover, gathering intelligence on a coordinated attack against 3 major ports. Her work led directly to the neutralization of 16 confirmed threats and likely prevented the largest homeland maritime disaster since 9/11. He paused, glancing toward Jake. When her cover was threatened, she maintained operational discipline. Even when that meant being detained by local authorities, her decision to stay silent safeguarded the entire operation. Jake felt a flush of embarrassment, remembering how confidently he'd processed her, how convinced he'd been that she was hiding something dangerous, and in truth, she had been. Just not in the way he thought. After the ceremony, as people filed out quietly, Barrett approached him. Detective, she said, her voice calm and steady. Thank you for coming. Jake stood and extended a hand. Commander Barrett, congratulations. She shook his hand firmly. I wanted to say thank you. For what? He asked, almost laughing. I arrested you. And you followed the rules, she said. You didn't cut corners. You didn't overstep. That kind of integrity is rare, and it matters more than most people realize. They stood in silence for a moment before she reached into her jacket and handed him a plain, sealed envelope. He opened it later in his car. Inside was a letterhead from the Department of the Navy, a formal offer, liaison officer position with a new joint task force designed to improve coordination between military intelligence and civilian law enforcement. The assignment: Eastern U.S. coastal regions, starting with areas impacted by Operation Silent Harbor. At the bottom, typed neatly in black ink, recommended by Commander Evelyn Barrett. Back in Maine. Jake stared at the ocean for a long time that night. He thought about the woman who had once said almost nothing to him, but had trusted him anyway. He thought about the way she moved like no one was watching, even when the whole room was. And he thought about the badge in his wallet. How it had always meant something to him, but maybe now it could mean more. 2 weeks later, Jake Mallory submitted his resignation to the Coastal Harbor Police Department. He cleared out his desk with quiet dignity, shook hands with the sheriff, and packed up a box that held 13 years of small, town policing. At the bottom of the box, beneath the files and the coffee mug, sat a folded piece of paper with one line scribbled in unfamiliar handwriting. "Some of us are always around. You just don't see us." He smiled. The fog was already lifting over the pine hills of Hancock County when Frank Sullivan pulled into the gravel lot of the shooting range he'd run for almost a decade. Just another morning, just another rotation of regulars, he thought, until he saw the government issue SUV parked near Lane 9. It wasn't official looking, but Frank had seen enough of those matte, black vehicles during his 22 years in the Navy to recognize when something serious was happening. He didn't need to ask who it was. She stood at the far end of the range, back to him, jacket sleeves rolled up, long rifle laid out in front of her on the table like an instrument before a concert. Same deliberate movement, same sense of stillness. Commander Evelyn Barrett. Frank approached without a word, stopping just short of the firing line. "Didn't expect to see you again," he said, arms crossed. "It's been, 3 months? 98 days. She replied without looking up. "You still keep your record books that detailed." Frank chuckled. "Old habits." She looked up and gave a small nod. The closest thing to a smile he'd ever seen from her. "I came to collect my gear." He gestured toward the office. "Sheriff brought it back 2 weeks ago. Said it was handled through official channels." "I figured that meant you were cleared." "Not just cleared," she said quietly. "Mission's complete." Frank studied her for a moment. Must have been one hell of a mission. It was. He didn't press. With people like her, silence often said more than answers ever could. Inside the office, he unlocked the steel locker behind the counter and retrieved a hard-sided black case. He placed it gently on the counter and stepped back as she flipped the latches open. The rifle was still pristine, disassembled neatly just as she'd left it. As she checked each component, bolt, barrel, scope, mount, Frank watched closely. Not to inspect her, but because watching Barrett work was like watching a master pianist warm up before a performance. After all, this wasn't just a tool. This was part of who she was. "You know," Frank said after a moment, "when they took you in, I thought about stepping in." She glanced at him. "But you didn't." "No," he admitted. "Didn't seem like my place. Besides, I figured if anyone had a plan, it'd be you." She locked eyes with him. "I appreciated that. More than you know." She walked back out to Lane 9 with the case, reassembled the rifle with practiced ease, then laid down prone, pressing into the gravel like it was second nature. The sun had begun to rise over the trees, casting long golden light downrange. The air was thick and uneven, exactly the kind of condition most shooters dreaded. Heat shimmer, crosswind, humidity off the harbor. Even the most seasoned marksman would hesitate, but not Barrett. She adjusted nothing. No scope, no rangefinder, no spotter, just breath control and instinct. Frank raised his binoculars from the booth and focused on the steel target over 1,000 yards out. A Twax 20-inch square mounted on a swaying post, barely visible through the mist. She took the shot. The rifle barely made a sound, suppressed, subsonic. A moment later, a dull clang echoed through the pines dead center. Frank blinked. "Show off," he muttered. She disassembled the rifle and returned to the office, wiping down each piece with a care that spoke of decades of discipline. "I'm surprised you didn't get reassigned," Frank said. "Figured someone like you would be back on deployment by now." Barrett paused. I asked for one stop before that. He raised an eyebrow. Why here? She met his gaze. This is where I stopped being invisible, she said. Not when the Admiral walked in. Not when the judge read the document. Here, Frank nodded slowly. Yeah, Lane 9 remembers you. As she closed the case, he hesitated for a moment, then asked, You coming back again? Maybe, she replied. Depends on the next mission. Well, this place'll be here. No cameras, no questions. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small card. No name, no rank. Just a phone number and a line of embossed silver letters. If you see something others don't call. Recruiting? He asked, almost smiling. Observing, she corrected. Sometimes the next protector doesn't even know who they are yet, but someone like you will. As she walked out toward her vehicle, he followed her with his eyes. Same quiet steps, same strong presence. But something had changed. This time, she didn't have to hide it. She opened the door, placed the case in the back, then looked over her shoulder. You know, Frank, she said, voice almost lost to the wind. Some of us were always around, you just don't see us. He raised a hand in a quiet salute. I do now. And with that, Commander Evelyn Barrett drove off. No headlines, no send-off, just the steady hum of tires over gravel. And a legacy that had quietly returned home. 3 weeks after Commander Evelyn Barrett's quiet return to Lane 9, the gravel lot at the edge of the range didn't hold pickup trucks and hunters like it usually did. Instead, a string of low-profile SUVs rolled in before dawn, their windows tinted, their plates untraceable. No sirens, no commotion, just calm efficiency, like a tide returning to shore without making a sound. Frank Sullivan was already waiting at the gate when the first vehicle arrived. He didn't ask questions. Didn't need to. Commander Barrett stepped out of the lead vehicle, followed by a man in civilian clothes with sharp eyes and the unmistakable gait of law enforcement. Good to see you again, Frank, she said. Frank tipped his cap. Mom, she gestured to the man beside her. This is Special Agent Jake Mallory, naval liaison formerly with the Coastal Harbor PD. Frank raised an eyebrow. The one who arrested you. Mallory gave a sheepish smile. Guilty temporarily. Barrett looked around the property, then back at Frank. We need the range for 72 hours. Exclusive use. No one in or out except our people. Frank didn't hesitate. It's yours. She handed him an envelope. Inside a check large enough to cover half a year's expenses. Frank barely glanced at it. You know you don't have to do that. Barrett nodded. We do things the right way, even when no one's watching. Especially then. By mid-morning, the range no longer looked like a place for sport shooters. A communications van parked near the office, disguised as a local utility company vehicle. The conference room became a tactical planning space. Targets were replaced with reinforced steel silhouettes and heat-sensing dummies. The firing lanes, they were repurposed as forward staging zones for reconnaissance kits and surveillance drones. The transformation was fast, precise, but quiet. Exactly like Barrett had always operated. Frank watched from the sidelines, quietly impressed. The men and women moving around the facility didn't wear uniforms, but they moved with discipline and purpose. They communicated without shouting, often with just a nod or hand signal. Some of them had the same marks Barrett bore, faint rope burns, telltale scars from a life spent in places maps didn't cover. They were assembling for something big, and Frank knew enough not to ask. But he watched, carefully. That evening, Barrett and Mallory pulled him aside. We're calling it Silent Harbor 2, Mallory explained. Based on the intelligence Barrett gathered during her last mission, we've identified a second network. Domestic operatives with international backing. They're using civilian infrastructure, substations, rail yards, even private marinas, to move equipment. Frank folded his arms. And you think they're operating near here? Barrett nodded. 3 possible sites, all within 50 miles. We don't have enough for a warrant yet, and we can't risk exposure. That's why we're staging here. Why me? Frank asked. I'm just a guy with a clipboard. Mallory exchanged a glance with Barrett, then said, You're more than that. You saw Barrett before anyone else did. You recognized what didn't add up, not because of a report, but because you noticed. That's the kind of eye we need. Barrett stepped in. We're building a civilian observer network. People who know how to blend in and know what to look for. You'd be our first. Frank looked out at the range, his range, now transformed into something entirely new. I'm not a soldier anymore, he said quietly. You don't have to be, she replied. We're not asking for that. Just keep watching. The following morning, the operation kicked into motion. Small teams left in unmarked vehicles, blending into civilian traffic. Surveillance drones launched from behind the shed where Frank used to store extra ear protection. Barrett remained on site, coordinating movement, while Mallory managed communications with federal partners and local authorities, most of whom were only told they were assisting with interagency intelligence training. The final piece came mid-morning, when one of the recon teams intercepted a burst of coded radio traffic coming from an abandoned warehouse near the harbor. Heat signatures. Comms patterns. Too much activity for an empty building. Mallory glanced over the satellite feed. We've got 8 confirmed individuals. Possibly more. Looks like weapons, maybe communications gear. Barrett nodded. Let's confirm. Quietly. Mallory picked up the secure line and called in a local tactical response unit under the guise of a training exercise. No mention of Barrett, no mention of Silent Harbor. Just a tip, perfectly timed. At 04:30 the next morning, the raid began. It ended before sunrise. 8 arrests, 0 injuries. A cache of illegal munitions and encrypted laptops, no headlines. Just one line in a press release. Joint operation between local and federal authorities successfully disrupted a suspected smuggling ring. By noon, the range was back to normal. The vans disappeared. Maps were taken down. Targets returned to their original lanes. No trace remained, except in Frank's memory. Barrett stood by her vehicle, prepping to leave once more. She handed Frank a new envelope. Inside a card, this time with a raised insignia and a secure contact code. We're gonna need other eyes, Frank. Across the region, you'll be our first observer. Quiet role. Trusted hands. Frank nodded slowly. I've still got one good eye left. She smiled. That's all we need. That night, Frank walked lane 9 alone. He ran his hand across the table where she had once laid out her rifle, then turned back to the small shed and checked the lock. Everything secure. As he locked the front gate, he looked out at the empty road and smiled. Because he knew, the range wasn't just a range anymore. It was something else now. A listening post in a world where silence could save lives. And he was no longer just a caretaker of targets. He was a sentinel. The following weeks passed quietly. Frank Sullivan continued to run the range like he always had, sweeping the gravel lanes before dawn, patching bullet holes, refilling target racks. But ever since Silent Harbor 2, every sound carried a different weight. Every visitor who stepped onto the property was watched just a little longer. Every hand position. Every breath before a shot. Because now Frank wasn't just a range manager. He was part of something larger, something invisible. It was a foggy Thursday morning when she arrived. No announcement, no conversation, just a dusty sedan, an old duffel, and a young woman who looked barely out of college. Early 20s, by Frank's estimate. Auburn ponytail tucked into a ball cap. Wore jeans and a gray hoodie, nothing fancy. But what caught Frank's attention wasn't what she wore. It was how she moved. No wasted steps, no hesitation. She paid for a full day pass in exact change, nodded politely, and chose lane 9. She could have picked any lane. But she picked that one. She assembled her rifle with the same ease Frank had seen only a handful of times before. Not rushed, not slow, just right. She adjusted the sling with practiced fingers and placed her hand flat on the shooting bench before lying down. Then she began to shoot. Frank walked slowly to the control booth and picked up the spotting scope. Not that he needed it. He could already guess what he'd see. Bullseye. Again and again. But it wasn't just accuracy. It was how she adapted. She adjusted for wind without instruments, shifted position as the sun moved, paused not to rest, but to observe patterns between breath and barrel rise. By the end of the hour, Frank didn't need more proof. He walked back into the office, opened the drawer under the counter, and pulled out a small plain card. No name, no logo, just a secure phone number, embossed in black. He dialed. It rang twice. A voice answered. Calm. Neutral. Bluebird, lane 9, Frank said. There was a pause. Assessment or operator? Candidate. Frank replied. Female, early 20s. Displays Barrett pattern efficiency. Adaptive shooting technique. Civilian cover story. College rifle team. Another pause. Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. We'll follow up. The line went dead. 2 days later, she returned, this time with company. A man in his 40s, weathered but composed. He didn't shoot, just watched her, occasionally offering a quiet word or subtle correction. Their dynamic wasn't familial, it was professional, mentor and protege. After 2 hours, she packed up. Before they left, the man approached Frank. Mr. Sullivan, he said, extending a hand. Appreciate your hospitality. Frank shook it. She's good. She is. The man nodded. But not invisible enough. You flagged her within an hour. Frank shrugged. She flagged herself, wind adjustment without gear. Commander Barrett used to do the same. At the mention of her name, the man's eyes flicked slightly, something between recognition and respect. She left a strong impression on you, he said. Frank smiled. You don't forget people like that. The young woman joined them. Her demeanor was casual, but there was a spark of recognition behind her eyes now. The pretense had dropped. How'd I do? She asked. The man answered first. Mr. Sullivan identified you before your second mag. She looked at Frank. What gave me away? He considered. Foot placement. Controlled breathing. And you didn't scan your surroundings when you walked in. Not like a beginner. Like someone who'd already assessed every exit. She grinned, but accepted the feedback with grace. I'll work on that. Before they left, the man handed Frank a sealed envelope. Inside was a new card, different from the first. This one bore the insignia of Naval Special Warfare, embossed in silver, and a new contact line. We're building a network, the man said. Observers, gatekeepers, talent identifiers. Quiet professionals who don't wear uniforms anymore, but still serve. Frank looked at the card, then back at the lane where the young woman had stood. I'm not a recruiter. You're a mirror? The man said. People like her show their true selves when no one's watching. You've got the eyes to see it. He paused, then added, Commander Barrett spoke highly of your judgment. That carries weight. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the tree line and the wind shifted off the harbor, Frank stood at Lane 9 alone once more. He didn't shoot, didn't clean. He just watched the horizon. He thought of Barrett. He thought of the young woman. And he thought of all the quiet professionals moving through this world, unseen, unknown, and entirely essential. He reached into his wallet and slipped the new card beside the first one. 2 cards. One purpose. The next morning, a package sat on the bench outside the office. Unmarked, inside a high-end spotting scope with thermal capabilities, a compact encrypted communication module, and a handwritten note, keep watching Frank. He recognized the handwriting. Barrett. Of course. He smiled, slow and sure, and carried the equipment inside, because this place wasn't just a shooting range anymore. It was a threshold. And he was the guardian. In a world that celebrates noise, titles, medals, headlines, this story reminds us of something different, something quieter, something more powerful. Commander Evelyn Barrett never asked to be seen. She didn't demand recognition. She didn't shout her worth. She simply showed up prepared, focused, silent. Even when wrongly arrested, even when misunderstood, she trusted her training, her values, and the people she hoped were paying attention. And someone was. A small town range manager named Frank Sullivan, a man who no longer wore a uniform but still remembered what integrity looked like, saw her. Not because she asked to be noticed, but because she carried herself in a way only the wise recognize. Later, when a young woman stepped into that same shooting lane, it was Frank again who recognized the signs. Not just skill, but discipline. Not just confidence, but character. And in that moment, he became more than a man running a range. He became part of a network that defends our nation, not with fanfare, but with vigilance. True strength isn't loud. It's consistent. It doesn't need applause. It just needs someone watching who still knows what right looks like. Whether you're in uniform or not, whether you're leading missions or sweeping floors, never underestimate the value of simply doing the right thing. Quietly, consistently, and with purpose, because someone will notice. And sometimes, just being the one who sees clearly can change the course of everything. What do you think? Have you ever met someone who didn't need recognition to lead, but whose presence changed everything? Share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear about the quiet heroes in your life. And if this story moved you, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, because more real, untold stories like this are on the way. And we're just getting started. Thank you for watching. And remember, some of us are always around. You just don't see us.